Hello there everyone and welcome back to the channel. The saying better late than never certainly applies to this video because although I'm 3 months behind in getting this out there, there are some absolute musical gems here that are going to be 100% worth your time. In fact, I'm trying something different here from the last time I did a video like this about music, so even if you don't fully agree with my musical tastes, you should still be able to find something that tickles your oral nerves in some way. See, instead of just focusing on a handful of albums that I consider to be the best for April, I'm going to be briefly touching on something like 70 albums broken down by genre from across the musical spectrum. I'll be sure to highlight those which I thought were the best, but if I describe something else that sounds more up your alley, also excellent. Links to all of these albums will be in the video description below in the order that they are discussed, but since there's a lot of ground to cover, let's get right to it. Let's start with the category of pop and indie music. I'm just going to lump those together, and as they tend to be the most popular, that's why we're starting with them. Kicking us off here is the EP All Over Again by the group OmniShift. This album is a collection of funky instrumental jazz rock tracks that are kind of a perfect fit for these late summer days, just full of good vibes and a sunny disposition. Next up, we have the EP Krugi by Второй, этаж, поражает. Here there are more of those funky summer vibes. I realize kind of April, I probably, this would be good to hear in the spring, but you can put these on your playlist for next summer, and you can enjoy them here. But again, these songs on the Krugi EP, these are kind of like stickier, a little more sultry in a lot of ways. They're really good for these dog days of summer that some of us are headed into. This EP also has a bit of the dream pop atmosphere, lots of reverb effects going on for those of us missing on those heady days of bedroom pop from the early 2010s. After that, we have Tanya's Eclectica, which is a fairly standard pop album here in 2024 in many ways, but it just kind of left me indifferent. The lyrics on this can be kind of insightful, even poignant in some regards, but they're just as likely to stray into the realm of unnecessarily obtuse. I would say that there are 3 or 4 solid tracks on this album for me personally. The mix seems to be lacking some sort of cohesive vision as to what atmosphere this release is going for overall. It's not a bad album. I just wasn't a huge fan of it. You might really love it. Up next, we have Мечты из пыльных углов by Bukva F. However, this has its sound locked down as opposed to Tanya's. So this is a throwback to pop and sort of the surf rock of the 1960s. I saw some Russian reviews for this album, which mentioned that a song or two reminded Russian listeners of some Soviet-era estrada and the vocal pop groups from that era, but I can't really speak to that. Personally, to me, it gave me some throwback memories to this Swedish group called Love Is All, but a more chilled version of that, which, hey, that's fine and dandy. Love Is All was a great group, Bukva F, with their EP Мечты из пыльных углов. Also really good, really fun indie rock. Шалый's похвальные упражнения is just this unabashed synth pop that incorporates hyperpop elements into it. Here, the tunes skew towards a summery atmosphere. Surprise, surprise, we're going to see that quite a bit here. Makes sense with the April release window. But here, with Shalıy's album, the lyrics tend to be a little bit more heartbroken or downtrodden. This album really might not age well, though, as the lyrics are kind of focusing on ideas which are currently trending, and, especially here in Russia, things like programmers connected to the mobilization and when a lot of them left, and the term, there's a whole song based around red flags, which the concept of red flags isn't going anywhere, but it being relevant in a pop culture sort of way probably is not going to age well. Still, this isn't one of my top picks for the top in indie genre. It is still ultimately a really good and really fun listen. Now, I've mentioned and I've talked about up until this point in time a bunch of albums which are relatively by unknown artists. So I want to talk about Little Big and their new album, Lobster Popstar. I feel like a lot of you probably know who Little Big are, but for those of you who don't, Little Big were the viral darlings of the Russian music scene internationally for a number of years, thanks in large part to their absurd and surreal YouTube music videos. Just type in Little Big on YouTube and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. Their latest release, however, is largely forgettable, though I'd wager most of their prior albums were basically the same story. There are definitely some fun tracks here, definitely a few standouts, but you can probably get all that you need out of the album by, like I said, going over to their YouTube channel and just watching the latest videos that have come off of this album. Another big release for Russian pop music in April was Mirele's Mrак, Привет. This is not a bad pop album by any measure. In fact, it's quite good. I really love the song "Пыль в глаза", but the amount of attention it got among music critics here and the overwhelming praise for it, it all led me to believe that this is going to be some mind-blowing, life-changing stuff, and it's not. At least it wasn't for me. It did, however, serve as a measuring stick against which I was able to measure the other hyper dark, female-led pop music, heavily influenced by the 1980s, that came out this month. There was quite a bit of it. I mentioned Naša Taня earlier. She does fall into this category as well. Anyway, with Mirele, the album, as I said, is enjoyable as a whole, but it's 16 tracks long and nothing really grabbed my attention, so it just kind of drags. 16 tracks is a long time with nothing that really stands out. Like I said, none of the songs are bad, but yeah, other than the overall atmosphere, that was the only thing I really took away from the album, and that's not really what you want with a pop album. Give it a listen. Mirele is an up-and-coming name, or she might already be kind of a headlining name at this point in time. I'm getting old, so I don't really know. But yeah, if you've heard it, let me know your opinion in the comments below, or if you listen to it and you have thoughts, I would love to hear them. Maybe I'm way off base on this one. Lurmish's Суперпозиция was an album that I was excited about because, again, I saw some reviews and I saw critics talking and comparing Lurmish to classic trip hop, to Fever Ray, even to Bjork. And this seemed like it was just going to be a slam dunk in that regard, but it is actually just evidence that influences don't always translate into the final product. Unfortunately, it's also the band's fourth album, so I can't write this off as the first try hiccups. Now, ultimately, on this album, there are some good ideas buried in there, but the lyrics and the singing and the production, they just often don't gel together, with elements frequently feeling out of place. The one exception I would say to all of this is the song Holod. It's the longest track on the album, and honestly, it's just a phenomenal song all around. Really, if there's anything you're going to take away from this album, let it be that song. I feel like with the last few albums, I've been kind of on a bit of a meh streak. Everything's kind of been mid in the opinion. Can I say mid? Anyway, it doesn't matter. With the pop and indie albums here. So I'm going to quickly hit on 3 more of them that I was really not impressed by before we get back to the good stuff. First up here, we have Sad твоего имени by Elli на maковом поле, Остальное by Yevtelya, and the Dionia EP by Pashkinsky Vor. I probably butchered some of those names a little bit, but moving along. The first one, Elli, this is just a classic piano plus female singer-songwriter formula, which is very hit or miss, and this album, aside from 2 tracks, the Везде and Убегай, is mainly a miss. Still, maybe there are some of you out there that will really get something out of these 9 heartbreak-laden songs. The second album, I initially thought about excluding from the discussion here entirely, but some of the songs are quite good pop with indie elements. It's just a healthy dose of experimental aspects and instruments which detract from the overall product and might be annoying for some, especially at first, although those same annoyances can eventually come to be seen as a key feature. And as far as the EP, the last one there, Pashkinsky Vor, is concerned, well, it's noisy and brash, and it's quite often dissonant, though in a way that's kind of vaguely called to mind Cloud Nothings and Car Seat Headrest, at least the early days of those groups. But it's the vocals. They are just ire-inducing, especially on the title track. And I sat through it, but I can imagine a lot of people would just turn this off the minute the quote-unquote singing starts. Quick aside here, I've been talking about albums that I haven't really enjoyed, but I do want to say that even with the albums I'm not really recommending or that I think are kind of throwaways in a lot of regards, I'm still going to try and find one or two or potentially even 3 solid songs off of those. And I'm going to be adding those to the Russian singles playlist I have over on Spotify. The link for that will actually be at the top of all of the other links here. If you've been listening to music there and you see 2 or, like I said, 2 or 3 tracks in a row, you'll understand that that is from an album. And if you have enjoyed those tracks, then, you know, maybe it's worth your time to go check out the album and the artist as a whole. Maybe you'll find something there that I didn't. Additionally, I should probably say with the Russian singles playlist on Spotify that I have been updating it pretty regularly now. I'm been adding, I would say, something like 2 to 3 songs daily. So if you haven't checked in over there for a while, you'll find quite a bit of new music that, again, just a lot of random loose songs there, but a lot of good ones. Resuming the talk of music, let's talk about some good pop and indie albums again. The Crab EP, I think it's Crab, Krabbe. I'm going to pronounce it Crab. The Crab EP from Star Cardigan. This is just another reminder that the 1980s is being reborn everywhere, with Russian artists doing their best, their damnedest to not be left behind. Don't let the opening vocals on this EP fool you. This is an upbeat and fun affair, not the post-punk you might be duped into believing based on those opening vocals. But I would say that there is a streak of Mumitrol here. So for those of you who know a little bit about Russian music, give it a listen and let me know if I'm right, if I'm hearing that, if that's just me. Speaking of classic Russian bands, we've got Artemyev with Krasny. Now, this artist here isn't really famous, nor is the music anything to write home about. It's just songs with the classic hallmarks of indie pop and rock, with a few avant-garde flourishes, mainly these piano interludes, which to me started to drag towards the second half of the album. But again, the reason I'm talking about this in conjunction with classic Russian bands is because it has much of what I would call, but I can't really define, the Russian rock sound. The lyrics here are hopeful, yet also realistic, and the sound itself fits the spring window, surprise, surprise, into which it was released. For those unfamiliar with what Russian rock sounds like, this isn't a bad introduction to the classic sounds. The duo Eddie released Samachustvia. They describe themselves and their sound as ethno-futuristic psych pop, which is kind of pretentious if you ask me, but if you like Crystal Castles and that industrial pop sound, but want clear, traditionally sung vocals, this is it. Honestly, it was close to a top pick for April for me, but didn't quite make it. Another honorable mention in the pop and indie category is Взрослый чемпионат по детских играх by Idst. This is an indie rock concept album, but one where the lyrics absolutely take the whole thing to another level. So the fact that a good number of viewers won't be able to appreciate it fully on, it did dock its standing a little, unfortunately. Still, if you can't understand Russian, this musically took me back to the glory days of Arcade Fire and other groups like Me Without You and Ockerville River. The concept itself, if I got everything correctly from the lyrics, is about an older man talking with an older teenage boy, or perhaps even a young man. This older man reflecting on what it means to be a man, unpacking things that we might label as toxic masculinity, looking back on times and actions that were both good and bad. It's stuff that might be wistful or mopey in a different style, but here it just really pops, and the musicianship is just, it's really good. Again, old school Arcade Fire. So I've got 4 top picks for pop and indie here in April. We'll start with the EP Skarolupa by Talnik. This is an experimental indie pop rock group that isn't afraid to mix in elements that make the songs feel as though they're ready to spill over into nu metal territory at times before then swinging back into these warbly songbird vocals akin to Dirty Projectors before then transitioning into just these sort of like funky bridges. There's a song here recorded as though the listener is secretly standing behind and watching their friend wash dishes while singing to herself. It's just a nice album in capital letters, and the cover art really drives that point home. I mean, look at it. If this isn't the most adorable cover you've ever seen, then please send me something to top this. Before we get to my favorite pop/indie picks of April, there are two more EPs that deserve your attention, and they are both dark, edgy pop by women, which seems to be riding a wave of popularity these last few years, but that's all good by me. Now, the two releases, though similar in some ways, do take different approaches to this sound. First, there's Gail Doherty with PTSR+. There's a lot of space on these tracks where Gail's voice just becomes the centerpiece, and throughout these songs, it sounds like she has just this massive chip on her shoulders, a lot of simmering rage. The sense of space is really driven home by the doubling and tripling of the vocals. Sometimes there's echo effects added in on top. It's as though she's just alone in some large empty space, surrounded only by these buzzing industrial sounds or bouncy synths. The size of the sound and these ethereal vocals and the backing tracks, it isn't all too far removed from Zola Jesus and the way she could make an album feel like smoke and mirrors, like chasing phantoms. The other release is, if I'm pronouncing this correctly, Entrails, maybe, EP called Sa. There's lots of wispy sounds here again, echoed vocals, a brooding atmosphere, but the tracks here want to move more. They're more filled in with sound and percussion. It's the type of music you could imagine people snaking their arms around to in the air, swaying back and forth. At times, I was a little bit reminded of Purity Ring, but these aren't throwaway tunes. They're catchy, and even if you're not going to get henna tattooed onto your hands and start a new age coven dedicated to Mother Gaia or whatever, these songs are still going to move you. There's a lot of good stuff going here on these EPs. But my favorite release in the indie and pop category, funnily enough, was the first album I listened to. It's Glavny Geroi, the fourth LP by Sava. For those who don't know, Russia and the former Soviet Union states love post-punk. They excel at it, probably due in large part to Viktor Tsoi, but that's a different exploration. Sava twists the well-trodden formula around to great effect, keeping things largely more upbeat thanks to swelling synths, funky bass lines, kind of sunny guitar tones, and also by not shying away from the liberal use of pop sensibilities, such as whistling, which in my book is a surefire way to grab me as a listener. Now, there are songs here where you'll find yourself thinking even less maybe Kino and more the Cure division or the Cure or Joy division. Sava are not afraid to use the whole spectrum of post-punk. And all of these things juxtaposed with the post-punk demeanor and the vocal delivery here, just all comes together wonderfully. I highly recommend this album. It's a really fun listen. So that was all quite a bit, and we're not even half finished. So we'll have a breather here by moving on to rap and hip-hop albums. Now, it's a breather because there aren't that many albums in April for this category, but also because I'm not going to spend a lot of time covering and analyzing them, as most of the things that make this genre great are elements like lyricism, flow, wordplay, all things that non-Russian speakers won't be able to fully appreciate. I'm not going to ignore these factors, and my top picks of April in rap and hip-hop all employ these things, but I'll largely be focused on how good something is from an outsider's perspective. So to start us off, there is I-61's Storytell. I'm using it for the baseline of everything else I listened to in rap and hip-hop this month because it was the best example of just mid, against which it was easy to measure all others. The production is average, the lines are average, the flow is whatever. It's not horrible, but it is not the thing you're going to remember, and it's not something you're really ever going to want to come back to. A step up from this is Dog Friendly by Sapa 13. The production is better. It's a little bit more sparse, called to mind the early days of Wu-Tang Clan, but not anywhere near as innovative in terms of production. The vocals here can be a tidge annoying as well, but it at least makes the delivery kind of memorable. The biggest hip-hop release in April was probably Platina's self-titled LP, the Latvian's fifth full-length. Platina got deported from Russia for performing on the wrong type of visa, and that probably helped to elevate things for this album as well. In terms of the music, if you remember the last time I did a video about Russian music, I mentioned Toxis, and this is kind of the same. It has great production, especially in the second half, where it feels like they just loaded all of the sickest beats, which a back-loaded album is kind of a wild concept, but the lyrics really are all just knockoff Drake sad boy garbage with plenty of auto-tune and just cringe English words like swag thrown in awkwardly. It just makes a lot of this painful to listen to. However, if you enjoy the newer version of hip-hop, as in like you're younger than 18, I guess, this might appeal to you. Otherwise, it's worth checking out, especially, like I said, the second half, just because there are some really good things happening there with at least the production and instrumentals. But the overall package is maybe worse than I-61. Now there's the Murcielago EP by Vato. Still, it's nothing radical here, but there are plenty of fun moving beats. Vato's flow is relatively interesting. And the whole thing, and this is important, feels like there's some love to what's being produced and to the craft of rap and hip-hop. Things are just popping better here. A lot of the earlier albums that I mentioned, it felt like these people were just doing it because it's a paycheck and it's something that they know is pretty hype right now. Whereas Vato, again, actually feels like this is something that means a lot to him. So I know I just decried Platina, who I realize I've been pronouncing his name wrong for like the whole last time I was talking about him. But anyway, I know I just decried Platina's album and his lyrics just a minute ago, these sort of sad boy antics, but Bureau on their album Homo Sincerus actually do it correctly. This is an album which takes inspiration from How to Dress Well and the early EPs of The Weeknd, as well as the baritone singing of the National's Matt Berringer. At least that's what I think. For these reasons, I am saying it's as much of an R&B album as it is Indian pop, but where it actually falls in the category isn't important. The music here has kind of a dejective and introspective feeling, but it also feels more mature. It's less like it's less looking for pity and more about coming to terms with love lost and missed opportunities. Though it's not all doom and gloom, there is a clear optimistic streak running through everything here. Kind of a nice album to put on. Not quite R&B, not quite pop, not quite indie, but just it's got a nice atmosphere. Okay, a další što, the new EP from Stjopa Ch, could easily have been in the pop category along with Bureau for its clean singing and song structures, as well as a sung acoustic track, but we're going to keep it here in the rap and hip-hop category. That's not an uncommon problem anymore, the blurring of lines between genres, which is good from a musical point of view, but it makes categorizing things kind of a pain. Anyway, for people who are big fans of hip-hop, but you like the radio-friendly stuff, this is going to be a good choice. And yeah, we're already at the top 3 in rap and hip-hop. First up, we have Sasha by Rudolf Strausov. If you watched my video on Saluki, you'll remember how much I loved last year's Wild East, and Sasha has a lot of the same sound collage elements and unusual approach to the instrumentation, such as using simple mouth trumpet noises or fists pounding on a table, and how the songs are put together. It all, in short, it's just music that demands your attention. The lyrics are a mix of sort of obtuseness and then lines aimed direct at the heart, delivered kind of in a style that's not all that far off from the Kazakh style that Saluki and other Russian rappers use. Also, the album ends with everyone's favorite song from Cheburashka, so bonus points for that. The runner-up goes to Zaloty Zuby's Post-Hardcore, an album that in really any other month probably would have taken the top spot. For anyone who remember the alt hip hop / emo rap group / whatever you want to call it, the group Y from about 15 years ago, this feels like a Russian spiritual successor. The lyrics have references to unpack for days, and they are largely focused on soul searching and a feeling of being burnt out. The music is fairly restrained. There's lots of synths, sounds lifted from the digital landscape of Y2K, just drum pads that often overtake the vocals. But the only reason for that is because the vocals themselves are just equally pulled back, as if they are resigned to the idea of defeat. All that said, this album is actually really fun to listen to. A lot of the songs have just an infectious aspect to them where they worm into your ear, just despite that overall doomer atmosphere. And then number 1, from the opening moments of Zaraza's Вы попали на мой район, with its lonely piano chords, which are soon accompanied by these deep and heavy electronics that are then laced throughout the album. From those opening moments, I knew that this was something else. The general atmosphere of the album took me back to Jeezy, back when he was still young, circa 2006, 2008, that urban desperation and hopelessness, but limitless love for the streets that you come from and the people you came up with. Вы попали can feel as bleak as the monotone bleak skies over Cheboksary on the cover, and the doomer lyrics don't always help, such as on Мой район устал. But then there are tracks like Дождевые and Фонари, where the delivery and music feel just outright triumphant. The mood of the whole crew together to celebrate success and overcoming the challenges thrown their way. So while the album doesn't allow you to forget the grim environment, which many here just struggle and slug through daily, there are islands of joy here and there, and that makes it all worth it. Zaraza really has crafted something great here, and I'm reminded of that each and every time I revisit this album. Moving into electronic music, I'm going to use the album Let's Start From the Beginning by Polar Zone. Honestly, I'd classify this release as post-rock, but the group from Yekaterinburg says that they are electronic music, so we'll go with that. There are plenty of atmospheric soundscapes and introspective tunes which attempt to sonically capture the journey from the void of non-existence to thought to life emerging, and then through to death and rebirth. Not the most out there album in terms of concepts, as you'll learn soon enough, but the group manages to pull it off well, and the album is a nice meditative one. In a similar vein, Petit Meteorite's Lunadelic EP is full of songs all identified as Dreams 1 through 4, which should give you a pretty good idea of what atmosphere you'll be getting here. However, it's not all Brian Eno ambiance. It's more retro 80s synths and nostalgic chill wave vibes, like the Technicolor dreams you don't want to wake from. And let's go ahead and talk about The Other Side by Belladonna, because it's also a dreamy, hypnotic album with these nice, groovy house tracks that they tend to find a zone and settle into them and get comfy, mainly in the middle of the album. Now, this isn't a horrible thing, but it would be nice if there was more movement and exploration, more dynamic range in these tracks. It would bring things more to life. As it is, you're more likely to also settle into a groove and kind of forget that the music is even going on, although there are definitely some fun ideas on these tracks. Evidently, Burial has awoken from his slumber once again, but for those not satisfied by his sparse release schedule, check out the Disposal Ashore EP by Kafa. It features that dubstep, spacey UK bass sound of a decade ago, and it's just the ticket for those waiting for something to scratch that untrue itch. Okna released his Nova EP on the 1-year anniversary of Dima Nova's death. Nova was the founder of the group Cream Soda, which is quite large and influential here in Russia. And the EP, in honor of Dima Nova, is just kind of this mixed bag of chill house with Balearic vibes. It's the kind of thing that's really good for a patio party or cleaning your house. It just feels good, but it doesn't really demand your full attention. Benzin by Mechaniczny Pios came out of left field for me. It's the side project of Andrei Lisikov, who is better known as the musician Delphine. This debut album under this moniker, it utilizes quotes from Fahrenheit 451, And I'm sure that this is also a concept album, that there's probably some idea or theme or whatever here. But listening to it, I really was only reminded of KMFDM remix albums from the late 1990s. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing, mind you. That's just the sound of the album. Subliminal's Underwater Love. This is an album which feels like a Windows 1995 computer undergoing a bad trip. It's just glitched out elements, frenetic mood shifts between and even within tracks. There's lots of reverb and echo effects. It's an album which walks the boundary between melodic and chaotic very well. The From Atmos EP by Kumsel, I guess, is a short jaunt of glitchy sounds and breakbeats, which I would say is probably perfect for fans of Aphex Twin or Square Pusher. Costy's album Live, because it's recorded as such, is another kind of dreamy and experimental experience. It often feels like the artist is just jamming out by himself, which could be. It is a live performance. These tracks, they kind of build layer upon layer upon layer, and at times listening to it, I really felt like it was something almost from Dan Deacon. Okay, with this next one, I really, for real, wasn't quite sure where to put it. Georgi with Второй album. It spends much of its time creating this dark and brooding atmosphere, though it does overuse effects like analog pops and static crackles at times. Not sure why. The reason I was hesitant to include it here in the electronic section is because quite a few tracks have solid pop structures and sung verses. It feels like a pop album at times. And I swear to God, the vocals at times are like Chester from Linkin Park, good old Bennington. A lot of times it feels like something designated for the radio and mass consumption, not like an oddball electronic project. I wasn't originally sure whether or not to include this because this is a remix album. It is the Eclectica remixes, which is a collection of reworking of tracks from Driada's album that was released earlier this year. And I haven't heard the original songs, but this collection is really in that style of the music blogosphere remixes from the first decade or so of this century, meaning that these tracks are all just like fun and energetic, bubbly. They're just really dancey. It's the type of thing that you would expect to hear when you see the word remix. And that era of online music blogs and wild remixes, those heady days, I can't help but recall wistfully groups like Mastercraft and Boys Noise, the Bloody Beetroots, and Yuxet. And if that type of heavy electro bangers, if those are missing from your life, then let me just point you in the direction of Janset's God-Given EP. If your nostalgia for electronic music takes you back a bit earlier than those years, to the turn of the millennium, then go with the Tartar for Titans EP by Velsky. It's got these big, energetic beats which feel like they would be right at home on a modern version of the Matrix soundtrack. How about some IDM? Owen Pitch, the stage name of Petersburg's Kirill Kontorshikov, put out his Feel EP, which are 4 tracks of IDM sprinkled through with glitchy goodness. There's also a sense of menace running through these tracks, which balances with the more upbeat sounds and elements to leave you unsure emotionally of just how to feel about what you've been listening to. What you will feel, though, is enjoyment. Before we get into my top picks for electronic music in April, let's talk about the OP's Out Bushroot, Out Neil, because it's a conceptual album that juxtaposes wonderfully with what comes next. Out Bushroot, Out Neil is, to quote the artist, a story about existential involution and the mystery of a living organism transforming into a plant. Light, photosynthesis, honey, insects, decomposition, and ancient horrors. A complete immersion into the depths of the floral subconsciousness. Musically, this is definitely not for most. For me, it called to mind Shackleton's music for the Quiet Hour. It's full of dark, again, glitchy sounds that create this brooding atmosphere, but there are large moments here too where it reaches these sort of bombastic heights. For anyone willing to venture in, be forewarned though. The final track is a 15-minute hellscape of feedback and just drone, and it's probably those ancient horrors alluded to earlier. Now moving on to the best of April in electronic music, first up we have Kunights and Starman's Amazing Transformation, the Electric Concerto for Robots Space Orchestra. This sounds like the title of an overly pretentious prog rock album from the 1970s, and it is honestly one of the most challenging yet rewarding albums I listened to in all of April. It is prog, let's get that out of the way, but it's also a trip through all of the genres even remotely connected to electronics in music, from funk to krautrock to IDM, with robo-vocals and space synths galore, really any sound that in one point in time or another would have been associated with robots in pop culture. Moreover, the album was influenced by rock groups like Tool and Nine Inch Nails and the Mars Volta. So, fun combination of things going on here. Amazing Transformation itself is a sonic story of people willingly giving up their humanity for cybernetic augmentation, only to be confronted after their transformation with philosophical horrors beyond the human experience. Kunights and Starman, which is a one-man project, he has outlined the individual developments in the story for each corresponding track on his VK page for anyone who is interested. So if you do listen to this, I recommend going over to his VK page and finding the description, because it is kind of mind-blowing how much thought and effort he put into all of this. Anyway, concept albums are usually an iffy thing in my book, but the change in atmosphere here fits with the song titles, and it all just works. It's a long album, so it is something that you can just put on for dedicated listening if you want to take a little prog trip, or you can just play it in the background while you're busy with other things. What I will say is that however you choose to listen to it, it is going to demand your full attention when you aren't expecting it. And it is an album that you will want to revisit to dig deeper into this really bonkers concept. On the opposite end of the serious spectrum, we have Dissident by Sinetsa, which feels like a beat mixtape, just kind of bouncing around between dubstep and trap and break beats. No track here sticks around for too long, less than 3 minutes for the most part, but it doesn't waste time in getting to the musical point, which is always catchy and driving. This is great stuff to throw on if you're going to have a quick run or a workout, or really just need to get something, you need to get all charged up for something. Dissident isn't blazing new trails in music, but it does power down the one that it has chosen with great strength and confidence. Veris Ideal, I guess that's how you pronounce it, is an album that I'm putting in the electronic genre, but it also has a foot firmly planted in the folk category as well. In fact, if you like traditional folk music from the Karelian taiga, but wish it had a heavy helping of dark gothy techno, then this is what you've been waiting for. The singing here is all done in Karelian, so I have no idea what they're saying, but it doesn't matter. This is one of the most interesting and engaging albums in the electronic and folk genres for this month, so go give it a try. Fantasy by Boris Redwall was another easy choice. The first part of this album feels like 90s Euro techno and Russian hard bass, but then it shifts to more modern pop techno with dance sensibilities. It's an album that just takes the listener through the last few decades of electronic music that was popular here in Russia and in Europe. DJJ XXL's It's Over, I'm a Legend is stylistically frenzied, each track refusing to stay still. The album is just bursting with that hyperactive energy in the same way as Girl Talk, though without the incessant glitch beats and sampling. It's heavily influenced by Russian funk, without leaning too heavily into it. And yeah, this was honestly kind of a surprise find that I dug up myself, and I'm really happy that I stumbled into it. Nobody from Nowhere by Ash 5, a relatively new face, is overcast skies at the end of winter. The first full track, Forest, calls to mind, again, I've mentioned them before, Crystal Castles, and that sound is a touchstone that is going to be heard occasionally throughout the rest of the release. You'll also get tastes of Witch House, but Ash 5 is a bit of a chameleon of electronic styles, again, from the last 2 decades, with modern beat tape sensibilities. He also uses a wide range of sounds and instrumental samples, which keeps things interesting, especially on longer tracks, which then have time to develop around those elements. The best electronic album of April, though, is Tricks by Monocle. With electronic music, I love to see the flexibility that digitally constructing tracks can bring with layering and warping, how songs can spiral around in on themselves while still progressing and growing. This short album does all of that. I first listened to it on an evening before bed, laying in the dark, just immersed in it, and it felt like the oral equivalent to a kaleidoscope, a fractal, where ideas and themes get layered upon as a song progresses, only for those ideas to return to the forefront in a new light later on. In some ways, it reminds me of Fortet, but less in your face, and it forgoes the heavy vocal samples. Tricks, the album, is both trippy and ethereal, yet it carries weight, and it will reward you on multiple re-listens. It's just really good stuff. The next category here is just other. It's a mix of traditional and folk music along with jazz and, well, other releases that I just didn't feel comfortable shoehorning in elsewhere. It's a grab bag of oddballs, but there are some interesting ones here, so let's check them out. In terms of true folk music with traditional instruments and singing, there weren't many releases that I encountered in April. So let's get the so-so one out of the way. Vidan Kalod is a group that has been making music for 2 decades now, and they are focused on preserving the craft of traditional Siberian music. However, their latest album, Birds, just didn't really do it for me. It's an unusual sound, the traditional one that they are doing, and it would feel experimental if you didn't know about the band. The vocals were definitely irritating at first. That said, the experience does grow on you. This isn't something I would come back to, but for anyone interested in what traditional Siberian folk music sounds like, here's your chance to find out. The next one, I honestly didn't know where to include. It's electronic, it's pop, it's metal/rock. So I'm just going to throw it, this amorphous little bugger, here. It's Что-то странно by Zatvornitsa. I want to recommend it, but I truly can't. The consistency is just off. The first track's opener is all misdirection. The next 4 tracks feel like the core of the sound of the album, or what it should be, but then the second half is just a complete tonal shift, which differs drastically from the first half, in the same way that the Road Warrior is tonally in a different universe from Mad Max. It's not bad per se, but it's just not tight enough to be a recommendation. What would likely be filed under ethnic music elsewhere, I'm going to call folk here. The Wealth of Life by Terek. This is a trio from the Altai region of Siberia who utilize traditional instruments and three types of throat singing. This is an oddball album, no getting around it. Far from what I would normally listen to, but these guys, they make it work. Seeing to it that the unusual sounds are bundled with relatively familiar song structures, and the last track in particular, it's a highlight of the album. For this other category we are currently in, this is definitely a recommendation. It's got the traditional folky thing, but it feels kind of poppy. It's good stuff. And it's also something that you probably would not ever listen to otherwise. Jazz music doesn't usually see too many big releases, but Being a Human Being by the Andrei Kandakov Quartet is one for Russia. The musicians here all have superb control of their instruments, and the namesake of the quartet is kind of a big deal in the jazz scene in Russia and to a lesser degree abroad. There are lots of fun solos, again, pop sensibilities, catchy tunes, really all the stuff that makes for an accessible jazz release. And seeing as how I do not run across such things very often, an accessible jazz release, I recommend you give it a listen as well. It's good if you like that type of music. Last up in the other category, my final, and I suppose I would say my top recommendation, is Kira Weinstein's Black Noise EP. This could have easily been put into the electronic category, but the spaciousness of the tracks, the range of woodwind and percussion instrumentation, makes it more experimental, bordering on soundtrack territory at times. However, there are fully developed ideas here that take the stage front and center too often for this to be considered background music. Let's finish things up with rock and metal music. First up, we've got the Прием EP by Можем Хуже. In short, it sounds like POD with hints of head PE, especially in the DJ scratching and vocal delivery. Now, I was never a fan of POD, but the sound isn't bad, necessarily, and Możem Húže is actually fun to listen to. In another throwback to the musical sounds I loved in high school, we've got Robochi Garadok's Lombard. This is the project of Russian rapper Basta, and it's named after the section of Rostov-na-Donu where he spent his early years. This isn't my favorite sound anymore, but if you're looking for something like Rage Against the Machine, Cypress Hill, Papa Roach, really anything in that rap metal vein, you're going to enjoy this. All the bands I mentioned with those last two groups were active at the same time as the group Kitty, who have recently made a small comeback of sorts, and following in the footsteps of those Canadian nu metal women, we have the all-female nu metal group Lead Horizon, maybe Led Horizon, I'm not really sure, and their album Never Satisfied. These ladies out of Novosibirsk also sing in English, so for any non-Russian speakers who want to understand the words, here's your chance. But yeah, anyways, it's another healthy dose of early 2000s nu metal-y goodness. Let's step away from this nostalgia trip in metal and talk about High Dragon Priest's Forgotten Tales of Abandoned Dragon Nests EP. Although only 2 songs long, both clock in around 20 minutes, and while the black metal vocals might make this a no-go for some, the music, which is a mix of black metal, classic heavy metal, and stoner metal, is just played really well. High Dragon Priests, they are primed to release a full album later this year, and this EP has me excited to hear what they'll do across their LP. The group Mirele released an acoustic version of last year's Жатва, and I'll admit, I'm not a fan of folk metal or things adjacent to it, so when this started spinning, I wasn't digging it. But it grew on me, and after going back and checking out the original, this version is hands down significantly better. If you like epic metal with orchestral elements minus the electric instruments, plus haunting female vocals and unusual and traditional instrumentation, this is going to be a solid choice. Let's get heavy. Catacomb Abscess. They are just brutal death and grind metal, and they are just bringing it as hard as they can on primeval mutilation. It's the type of thing that is going to sate those wanting something a la Cannibal Corpse. This is definitely not for most, but for those who like that sound, this is a short and fun run. Slightly more accessible is Serpent Sermon's Jahannam. This is blackened death metal with English lyrics, all focused on Persian mythology. The musicianship is solid, though fairly by the numbers. I wasn't blown away by any tasty, memorable riffs, meaning nothing has stuck in my memory. It's an album to slap on and get some work done, but it's not one that is going to stick around with you. On the other hand, we have Gmork, a Russian language black metal band from Nizhny Novgorod, named after the nightmare-inducing wolf from the Neverending Story. Their latest album, Etude, feels primed to spin out of control half the time, but they've got riffs for days and moments that have just a ton of meat on the bones, so to speak. Early on, I would say that this was a top metal contender for April, and although it's still a really good album, it just can't fully compete with some of what's to come. But we're not quite there yet. Moving along to a sound more akin to emo, Na Pamять gave us Ты помнишь, как всё начиналось. The screaming vocals, typically backing, I could do without here, but the singing and inclusion of violin on the tracks gives the album an overall melancholic feel, which is probably appropriate for emo. I was never really into this style in its heyday, but this album here is done well to the point where I went back to give older groups like Thursday and Brand New a re-listen. Утешение gave us their EP Конец Веселья, their take on the 1990s alt-rock sound, and while it's obviously not reinventing the wheel if you enjoy Dinosaur Jr., the Breeders, or the Pixies, and you want all of that with just a splash of Paramore, then this is worth the price of admission. Soundlia's Yunus pod землей is a solid dose of alternative rock and various shades of emo from the early 2000s, which often encapsulates that sense of something vital in your life just slipping through your fingers. Another EP, Бесконечный отпуск навсегда, is incredibly short, 3 songs for a total time of about 7 minutes, but it's just this delightful pop post-punk mixed with shoegaze. It's an album designed for summer nights which feel as hazy and dreamy and feel about as long as this EP. One last EP, one which is not quite in my top picks, what we'll call an honorable mention here, Anti-Object Task Force's Oko. This is a psychedelic stoner rock from Tambov, and they love to play around with spaced out sounds, but it never gets too far off the ground. This is a group that, well, they ground themselves, and then they kind of show their teeth when they switch over to a more aggressive driving sound akin to Kalesa. All right, I've got 5 top picks for rock and metal in April, and they're mostly all quite different in terms of style. Kicking things off is Grechka with Ruskaya Toska. This to me screams Paramore. Like Grechka went straight for Hayley Williams' playbook and went through all of the notes one by one. Now that said, there are more pop elements and sounds mixed in here, so it's not a complete clone or ripoff, nor is it derivative. Don't take all that I've said thus far to be critical, because this was such a blast to listen to, and it keeps that joy on repeated spins. I'm going to give a short explanation for Hope Lake's Sony Paralich, but don't take that to mean that it's not good, because that's very much not the case. All I've got to say here, and this is for those who need to hear this, and it'll be enough for them, is this. Silver Sun pickups, Jimmy Eat World, and Paramore in equal measures. Chef's kiss. An equally short review takes us back to blackened death metal with Idama's Shades of Cold Despair. Now, I've already talked about 2 groups in this style, but this EP just goes hard from start to finish. My only complaint being that the drumming could be a bit tighter, but that's just splitting hairs at this point. A group which I might have unknowingly called 5 pounds or 5 hashtags due to their unusual choice of a name is actually known as 5 Diaz or Pat Diaz. And it's a long-running nu metal group from Moscow via Vitebsk in Belarus. Their short album/EP, Внутреннее возгорание, is the best and tightest sound of the nu metal genre, a genre that many had written off as dead just a year or so ago. It dabbles in all the trademarks of the genre while not being afraid to branch out a little bit, such as on the interlude Vyzov. And here we are at the final and best track for rock and metal in April and for the month as a whole. Сны Балтийского моря by Шумы, Штормовых, Широт. A trio out of Moscow. They've released a handful of post-rockish albums in the past, but with their latest release, they drew inspiration from the ocean, the Baltic Sea in particular. The name of the album translates as Dreams of the Baltic Sea. The group's name even translates to something relative to this idea, noises of stormy latitudes. And the sea, the ocean, those limitless expanses of water, they're places of great serenity, but they're also brutal and unforgiving given their mood. This album encapsulates all of that in something which is a cross between Russian Circle's more recent output and Mastodon's Leviathan. When things get to churning, the guitar and bass gallop and roil like waves just crashing over the sides of a hapless vessel caught in a storm. The riffing on Chornaya Gavin is top-notch, the thing that still gives me chills even months after first hearing it. And the end of Portsmouth rises to such heights, it's simply glorious. The drums are the rhythm of oarmen in sync, or some Lovecraftian horror awakening in the depths. This album is inspired instrumental storytelling at its best, though there isn't a narrative here. I should also mention that I recently suffered through 2 opening acts at a basement BSDM metal show here in Moscow in order to check these guys out live, and their live performance is just as energetic and moving as I had hoped it would be. This album, Сны Балтийского моря, it was released independently, but this trio deserves to be picked up big time and supported and promoted, because I haven't heard an album that's had me this stoked in ages. As to why this is the top pick of the month, well, honestly, it's because I know I'm going to be coming back to it again and again. Not just this year, but in years to come. And I know my reaction to this music won't be lessened by the passage of time. in the same way that the opening riffs of Blood and Thunder call forth the same frantic energy in 2024 as they did in 2004. In that same way, the turbulent onslaught of Vyborg in 2024 is still going to leave me floored. There you have it, the Russian albums for April 2024. This video is going to be much longer than I anticipated, I'm sure, and I'm going to be reworking the format of this in the future to streamline things significantly, but I want to be able to highlight more albums, not just my top picks, because as I stated before, my tastes and yours, they might differ to some degree, and a lot of these artists are young and independent, so getting them additional attention might help them to keep working and honing their craft so that in the future, they might release something fantastic. I'm already putting together May's albums, and like I said, the format will be a bit different, and I'll definitely try to cull the herd a bit further around this time. I'm probably also going to change the format so that I will be talking a little bit less when it comes to just sort of regular releases, but you'll see that in the next time around. As I said at the start of the video, links to all of these albums will be below, so be sure to go check some of them out on Spotify. If there are some that you really, really like and you want to support, a lot of these artists have band camps as well, where you can actually purchase their albums. So again, small artists, they need that support. So if you're in the market and you find something that you really love, hit them up. They'll be greatly appreciated, I'm sure. As I said earlier too, I have been updating the Russian singles lists over on Spotify as well for standalone tracks, or as I mentioned earlier, really good tracks from albums which were overall not great. This has been a lot. I have a feeling this is going to be my longest video ever, for better or worse. But yes, I hope there was something good here. I know I wasn't able to give previews of the music. That would have made this just ungodly long. But yeah, go check some of this stuff out if you like music and you want to get a taste or an understanding of what's happening in the music scene here in Russia. This has been Russia in Context. Thanks for watching.